All Things DER podcast, brought to you by AEIC. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Cook. In this podcast, I dig in, define, and discuss where the new energy economy is heading with electric industry leaders and explore all the ways that distributed energy resources can modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thank you for joining us. In today's episode, I'm talking with Christina Alston, the Transmission Development Manager at the Georgia Transmission Cooperative. As one of the largest transmission cooperatives in the country, GTCs exists to serve its customers with the increasing demands of DER to bring power to people when they need it most. We discussed the importance of allowing time for the utility industry to meet the increasing demands of its customers while simultaneously within an organization to anticipate and plan for the implementation of these new technologies in the coming years.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That is really a great introduction. So yes, and I'm also an electrical engineer in the power industry and have actually worked in the power industry my entire professional career.
So I think one thing about where we are in this dynamic tipping point or merging on the fourth industrial revolution, we all in the energy industry find ourselves dealing with this new emerging technology. So your title was very fitting. And you're coming from a very unique position, I think. And it's my goal is to get the input from the different states operating under the different RTO and ISOs, as well as the transmission and the distribution perspective, because we all have to really be thinking along the same page. So I guess I just wanted to, tee you up, why don't you speak a little bit about Georgia Transmission Corporation, how you guys are set up and run your business?
So, that's a very good point. So Georgia Transmission Corporation is solely owned by the Electric Membership Co-ops of Georgia. So we are actually a cooperative. We are a transmission cooperative, one of the largest in the country, and we are based in Atlanta, Georgia. So being just a transmission cooperative, what we do here is we plan, we design, engineer, and construct the transmission facilities for the co-ops of Georgia. We are a not-for-profit organization, which we're very proud of, and we really pride ourselves in working throughout both the metro Atlanta area and working for the people in rural Georgia as well.
So from a transmission perspective, like the idea of DER, which is distributed energy resources, typically we're dealing with new emerging technologies at the edge of the grid, such as electric vehicles, solar, battery, any generation really. And now with everything going on in the world, electrification of our homes and customers in general. So what, from a transmission perspective, is one of your favorite DERs, or maybe the DER that you're most focused on to have an impact?
So a lot of the DER work, of course, is solar and batteries, but I tend to look more towards the beneficial electrification. What is coming down from an emerging trend that is going to have an effect on the transmission system? Specifically, the two that I'm focusing on right now are electrification of fleets and indoor agriculture. Those are the two loads that I see not only have benefit in terms of how we can manage them from a demand side management program, but also that they will have impact and whether or not we can position ourselves as a partner to help with how much those loads will actually impact the grid. So if we do a little bit of a deeper dive into fleet electrification, the things that I think about are, when I look at my transmission grid, where are my hot points or my hot spots going to really develop? Where are my C&I customers who are more likely to electrify their fleets? And then what are those impacts going to be on the transmission system that serve those areas? And I think it's very important to do a deep dive on that. And for a couple of reasons. It actually goes all the way down to the distribution level. And in terms of making financial decisions with respect to the transmission and the distribution. If you know where these hot spots could develop, you can sit down now and in a planning mode, you can really think about, if I have to make a system upgrade, do I now consider making a more impactful system upgrade. So for example, you may say, okay, well, I've got 1/0, which is what they use out in the distribution field. And you'll say, well, we're going to go ahead and put in 336. At that point, you really make the decision, you're going to make a big leap. So instead of going from 1/0 to 4/0, you'll say, I'm going to go from 1/0 to 3336 ACSR. And the reason for that is because when you are in construction mode and when you're putting in facilities, sometimes the incremental cost of going to the next level is not significant. Whereas if you did it after you've completed a job and then you have to reassemble crews and then you have to respond, that could be a lot more significant cost. So on the transmission system, I would like to push the envelope a little bit more and say, if we're upgrading transmission facilities, if instead of putting, say, maybe a 40 MVA transformer, I may decide to go with a 50 MVA transformer, because I know, again, that the differential, that delta between the 40 MVA and a 50 MVA transformer is not that significant. However, if I have to create a whole new project and re-engineer the entire project, and then now I have an asset, a 40 MVA transformer that is not fully depreciated, which is something that my accounting folks, they really dislike us removing an asset that is not fully depreciated. So when you have an opportunity to look at your system and then think about where these hotspots are, think about the projects that you have coming down the pipeline, and then look at it from a perspective of where should we be making maybe an additional transmission or distribution investment, thinking that these projects may appear within the next 36 to 60 months. Now, when I said that, for us, since we're a not-for-profit organization, that leap is a little bit bigger for us. We're basically making a financial commitment based on a load that hasn't shown up yet. So it does take a little bit more planning. So, when I speak to other groups, that's really the message that I like to move forward is work with your finance and accounting, take into consideration your planning, and then try and figure out where those hotspots are going to be or where they could develop on your system, and then make those decisions accordingly.
So kind of stemming off something that you said, like in regards to planning, and that's the world I sat in for the majority of my career, is you have all of this new dynamic information, right? For the last 10, 20 years, it's all about load decline. And therefore you really haven't had that model to continuously increase your grid and build up the capacity because it was declining. So like we've been in that mode for maybe 2-3 decades, but now with beneficial electrification thread, transportation electrification, all of the fleets electrifying, you're now able to have those conversations like, let's think next capacity size. And have you seen that shift in your discussions, like getting all the stakeholders aligned up that this is happening and the load, even though it's not written in stone and a partnership agreement signed, all that, like you have to plan.
And you're exactly right. I mean, we're probably the only industry on the planet that tried to convince people to use less of our product for the last 3 decades. I mean, who does that?
Right.
And now we find ourselves on this precipice of trying to figure out how big these loads are, when are they coming, and make investments in a timely manner. But thinking about the EVs and the fleet electrification, I think it has to start with planning. We have to really think about, and you have to work with your GIS people. If you're fortunate enough to have really good GIS people on board, and if you're fortunate enough to sit down with your marketing folks and say, okay, here is the total customer base. Which of these customers have either announced that they're going to do fleet electrification or they're being incentivized to do fleet electrification, and then move forward. So you have to, it's almost where everyone has to come together now.
Right.
It's your GIS people, your CNI people, your marketing people. We all have to come to the table now to make planning decisions. Before, we were kind of like, okay, well, this is how much it grew in the last 5 to 10 years. This is how much we think it'll grow in the next 5 to 10 years. And planning was quite simple and
isolated almost.
It was almost finite. I mean, we hardly ever missed it. But now the stakes are a lot higher because, one, fleet electrification can happen a lot faster than me improving my transmission system. And so what I'm stressing is have those conversations early, have them often. Your CNI customers have to know that your supply chain cannot react as fast as their supply chain can to get the fleets up to speed. So when I say our supply chain, that means, the buying of poles and transformers and wires, the things that we do as a transmission or distribution company in order to serve the load. We have a planning process. We have a time frame. We know how long it takes us to build these projects. And a lot of that is acquisition, either acquisition of land, acquisition of materials. That's a slow process.
Yes. And it's hard.
Very slow. It's very slow.
Like, just like you said, we have to bring the internal stakeholders now into the planning realm, just internal to a utility of how to design the grid. But then there's this, we need to create the win-win-win. Like, there is enough there for the chargers, all the infrastructure on the demand side to be a part of this solution making. And I think that's the biggest challenge, because outside the electric industry, people move fast and quickly. And we really, like what I heard you say, is we need to understand more granularly, maybe not from a top down, but from a bottoms up, of where our developments are occurring and coming. So this whole idea of having representation of your economic developments of your different counties that you serve in your cities and your boroughs, you need that intelligence more than ever. Then we have to holistically understand the preparedness of the grid and where we can onboard. And then that's when you dig into the financial impact. So really talking about how do you stack rank which project goes first, not knowing the relevancy of these customers. Yeah, so it's very dynamic. So I feel like
it is. And one of the messages that I keep hearing is that the grid is not ready. And I don't agree with that. And here's why. Everyone who works in the utility, we take this position of we have an obligation to serve, and we take it very seriously. We're one of the few industries that the minute something catastrophic happens, we are the first on the scene just as quickly as first responders, and we work tirelessly to get people back up and running during any major disaster. I mean, the utility crews, we are extremely responsive. The thing is, it's not the message that we cannot serve the load. The message really needs to be, you need to give us time to get there to serve the load. I made the analogy the other day. If you were going to double the size of your house, you have to pull a permit. You have to, somebody has to come and inspect that. But you know that you cannot double the size of your house with your existing panel. So I don't understand this concept that you should be able to double the size of your load at your facility and not involve your local utility. I don't know where that disconnect has happened. And I've heard this message time and time again that the utilities, they can't, that's the biggest problem. I don't think that that's the biggest problem. I think it's the lack of understanding and communication on what utilities do is the problem, because we will respond and build to meet the load. But you've got to tell us it's coming. And you have to tell us in a timely manner that it's coming.
Right. And I think, this is the objective or the mission of this podcast is, really we as a society need to discover new ways where we can optimize the power grid for the benefit of the environment while addressing these economic impacts. And we need to be a part of that power of three, right? The customer, what they want, the new emerging technologies and where they want to sell them and how they want to drive their new business line. And then the utility that ultimately has to show up, like you said. And I think the most important thing in my perspective is this education, that you and I are sharing today. And hopefully, we plant one or two seeds in the minds of someone to explore that can help that relationship that I think has kind of eroded over the last couple of decades of like how important we are to show up in a timely manner. So I guess
people, they assume, I think of how devastating it is when you walk into your house and the lights are on. You're like, what happened? Who did this? It's right up there with what happens if you turn on the faucet and the water is not there. It is essential to our way of life. And, the grid is here, and the grid it's managed. And I think that people have to understand our industry and know that we're here to serve. But you have to give us a chance to do so.
So with that, what do you think is the biggest takeaway or lessons learned that you, with everything going on? There's a lot of topics that we can get into, but just, off the top of your head of one area that, you'd like to share
So, when we go back to the 80s and 90s, we know that demand side management works. It may not be futuristic enough for today's society, but the reality is it's good, strong technology, and we know it works. So we need to think about how we can apply demand side management to the new loads that are coming online. That is the reality that we live in, and I think educating all of the customers to understand the benefits of demand side management is a starting point, because it gives us a really good platform to understand if you bring on a fleet and you have the ability to use DSM to manage the growth of that fleet. And then maybe we incentivized DSM programs all through the late 80s and 90s and into the 2000s where there were credits. There's no reason to think that that model is broke. But again, I understand that people think, oh, well, that's not new technology. But it is tried and true. And it's a very elegant solution to this type of problem.
Yeah, and so just from terminology and language, I think, that's another thing that trips us up. So when you say demand response management, so you're also talking, load management in general.
That's right.
It's nothing new. And then really the new terminology that I think is the buzzword is DERMS, right? Distributed Energy Resource Management System, which pull it back 30 years ago is really demand response, but more on the granular level. So
that's right.
We've been doing bulk kind of decisions. Now it's like, can we, and we can with the increased power and data analytics and all of that to really drive down to that granular. So it's all really that umbrella, and we need to move that forward.
For years, you think about how many utilities controlled things as simple as pool pumps. This technology, it's almost in its, grandfather phase. It's wise and it's tried and true. And some of the communication has changed. And so that is the new part where, the communication has changed, but the response is there. And when we're looking at the system, that's a piece of the puzzle that I don't want us to lose sight of as utilities. We know how to control that space very well. And there's no reason that we cannot work hand in hand with our customers to continue. I see it as a continuation of those relationships. I see it as, we were doing demand side management years ago. There's absolutely no reason why we cannot, especially these types of loads where, vehicles don't need to charge all day and stagger charging. They can charge at night when the system peak is down. There are so many things that can happen here where we can work together collaboratively to make sure that you have the power when you need it.
I agree. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for your insight and your overview. And I think, industries don't always share the same goal, right? So, but everyone could agree the power grid needs to run safely, efficiently, and continue to be reliable. And the new word, resilient. So, we have a lot to work on, and I look forward to continue our relationship in the industry as we grow together.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I think this is a really important conversation for our industry. I think it's important for our downstream customers to also start to get plugged in and connected. And I think as utility people, we need to make sure that we keep our passion, which is really, as you say, providing safe, reliable, cost-effective electricity. And I think moving that message along, we've been here all this time, we're not going anywhere. And we want to make sure that you have the power when you need it.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of All Things DER. Thanks for tuning in. I hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode next week. Until then, keep powering on.